Hey there, and welcome to the channel. If we haven't met before, my name's John. Today I'm going to show you how I built this French cleat wall for my workshop. So why a French cleat wall and not just a few pieces of good old-fashioned pegboard? Well, this wall mount storage system is a convenient way not only to store your tools, but to organize them and move them around so that they're within easy reach of whatever project you're working on. Let's say you're building a cabinet and you need to reach for glue and clamps. Here they are. Let's say you're putting in a screw with your driver, but you want to finish tightening the fastener by hand. Well, the right driver is right here within easy reach, sorted and easy to grab, versus digging in a tool bag or drawer or tool chest. When you move on to the next project, the holders can easily be moved around so that more frequent tools are close and others are well organized, ready for the next project. Cleat hangers are much more convenient than a pegboard, where to move a tool, you need to remove the peg and then find peg holes that are open, working around all the other tools that are hanging. It's not something you'll want to rearrange very often, and I honestly think that tools on cleat holders just look better than on a cluttered pegboard. The French cleat wall is not just for looks, but it's a way to make your workflow more efficient, which in turn helps you use your time to build and not hunting around your shop for tools. So if you're not familiar with how a French cleat works, here's a quick rundown. There are two components, a wall cleat that you can see right here. This mounts directly to the wall, and then on the back of each tool holder is a tool cleat, and this mounts just like this at a 45-degree angle. When these are seated together, they form a nice tight bond that securely mounts the tool to the wall. To assure a nice secure connection where the cleat holder won't fall off the wall, you want to make sure that taller cleats either rest up against another cleat on the bottom below it, or that you have a spacer behind the cleat that's at the same thickness as the tool cleat, which in this case is 3/4 of an inch. You also want to make sure that your cleats are wide enough to support the lateral or side-to-side weight of the tools that are going to be on it. You don't need to have the tool cleat come all the way out to the end, but a good rule of thumb is to have it support at least the outer third of your wall holders, whether it's with a single cleat or if you use two separate cleats, one on each side. For the build itself, the first step is to define the space that you want to cover with wall cleats. This will help you determine how many strips that you'll need to cut. I started my wall cleats just above the workbench at 43 inches from the floor, and I ended the top 46.5 inches above that, giving a total of 9 rows that are spaced exactly 3 inches apart. How do I know this? Well, I made these spacers to make sure that I couldn't fail to keep the correct spacing. The wall cleats are made from a 3/4 inch sheet of birch plywood, and while using birch plywood isn't the cheapest option, I thought it would look better than construction plywood and figured this was a cry once, buy once situation, as I'd be looking at this thing every time I walked in and out of my workshop, which is also our garage. For the backing, I also used birch plywood, but only opted for a 1/2 inch thickness, as this plus the wall cleats are fastened 16 inches on center directly to wall studs. And for fasteners, I used some deck and construction screws that I had on hand that were long enough to go through the plywood, the sheetrock behind the plywood, and into the studs. Using a 1/2 inch material saved a little bit on the cost, but it definitely saved some heavy lifting, as I was a one-man crew hanging these big plywood sheets. And speaking of hanging, I gave myself a little help by tacking these scraps of 2x4 lumber at the height of the bottom to rest the sheet on while I fastened it into place. I also decided that a single 4x8 foot sheet was not tall enough to reach the height that I wanted, so I ripped down a 4th sheet of plywood into 16-inch sections to add a little more height to the wall. And this allows the bottom of the panel to tuck behind the miter station or workbench here, so I don't see any sheetrock for a more continuous look. I covered the horizontal seam between the 2 sheets of plywood with a row of wall cleats, but more on that in a minute. As I mentioned before, I used 3/4 inch thick plywood to make the wall cleats. Each row of cleats is 2 3/4 inches wide, which I made first by cutting 5-inch strips of plywood using my track saw, and then ripping them in half at a 45-degree angle on my table saw. You can use a table saw to do all the work, but I don't have an outfeed table yet, and I found that it's easier and more accurate, and probably safer, to move a 9-pound track saw around instead of shoving a 70-pound sheet of plywood through a table saw. Each sheet of plywood yielded or made 18 strips of wall cleats, so I had to rip a second sheet down to get a total of 28 strips that I needed. I then lightly sanded the sharp edge of the bevel so it wouldn't catch and fray during use or inadvertently cut my fingers or give splinters when moving tool holders around. Now, those paying attention would say, wait a minute, I thought you did 9 rows of wall cleats over 3 sections, and doesn't that add up to 27 strips? Well, you're right, except that I decided at the last minute to add a 10th row right here, right above the jointer, just because I could. I also reused some metal cabinets that I had in my shop before, so I didn't actually need 9 full rows on this wall. And I'm saving the extra cleats for a future wall addition to get rid of that ugly pegboard that you saw earlier in the video. And while we don't always agree on my decorating tastes, my wife even said she's on board with that plan. Pun intended. With a stack of cleats, it's time to get work hanging them on the wall. I wanted to minimize the number of seams and screws that would show up on the wall, so I started my first cleat here at the seam. I pre-drilled and countersunk screw holes 16 inches on center, lining up with the stud locations in the wall. With the screws tacked in place, I could sink the first screw and then perfectly level the wall cleat with one hand and finish fastening with the other to give a solid starting point for the wall cleats. I then used the 3-inch spacers that I cut to space the remaining cleats up and down from that position. I continued this process across the entire wall until all of the cleats were in place. Some variations of this process that I've seen include using glue in addition to screws and building the wall sections on a table, then hanging the assembly on the wall. However, I chose to build this in place because I wanted to assure a perfect and continuous fit from section to section, as you see right here. And I also didn't want to glue in case I would decide someday to move or upgrade to a bigger workshop. This way I can remove the French cleat wall and reuse it at a different location. Attaching the wall cleats directly onto the studs provides all the strength that I'll need for hanging clamps and shop tools. And now with the wall cleats in place, I can begin the process of building tool holders to hang stuff up and organize my shop. The first thing that I'm going to tackle is building some holders for all of my screwdrivers. I'm building 3 separate holders, one for Phillips screwdrivers, one for flatheads, and then another for Torx drivers and other miscellaneous tools. And the first thing that I did was lay out all the tools and group them by type. I then cut plywood shelves large enough to hold 3 rows of drivers and a backboard that I'll attach the tool cleat to. Next, I cut side panels at 45 degrees to support the shelf. I marked out locations, spacing them enough so that the handles would be accessible to grab without crowding the tools too easily. For the larger drivers, I used Forstner bits to punch holes out in the shelves, and then I dropped down to a smaller bit for the other holes in the shelf so that the shelf would hold a variety of driver shaft and handle sizes. I repeated this process for the other tool holders and then moved on to the shelf assembly. Here I just used wood glue and tacked the panels together with 18-gauge brad nails. And after giving them a quick sand, I cut a tool cleat off from one of the offcuts of the wall cleats and attached it to the back of the tool holder. I clamped this in place, wiped out any excess glue, and double-checked spacing to make sure that the holder would hang level once on the wall. And here you can see the final product. What I like about this holder is that I can easily identify the type and size of driver without having to dig through my tool chest drawer. I used a very similar process to make this chisel holder. One variation is that after I drilled the holes with a Forstner bit, then I cut the notches with a jigsaw and sanded these on a spindle sander to allow the chisels to slide in from the front. Next, I moved on to this box that holds a magnetic tool holder. This is really handy for screws and driver bits that always seem to float around on my bench during projects. And I designed the box to sit under the edge of the metal tool holder, which allows me to remove the tool holder if I need to take it somewhere. Now, years ago, I made a mobile clamp cart that I could wheel around as I work on projects. And while this is convenient, I found that taking the clamps on and off the cart was cumbersome, and I thought that these would look great on the new wall. I built several holders starting with this design for my Bessie clamps, which have large clamp head, and I used a similar style but different spacing to build holders for smaller clamps and to sort them by size and type. For the design, I cut 11-inch wide sections of 1/2-inch thick plywood for the backs and 9-inch wide sections of 3/4-inch thick plywood for the sides. I also cut these 1.5-inch strips to use for the tops out of 1/2-inch plywood, so that I wouldn't damage the top plywood edge of the side supports when moving the clamps on and off the holders. I rounded each of the front edges using my oscillating belt sander with 80 grit sandpaper. And you could do this other ways, but I found that the belt sander gave me the best results for rounding out a half circle on all of the edges. I cut the sides at a 45-degree angle, and I beveled the edges where I needed to allow shorter clamps to fit on the rack. For the tops, I cut the length to give an inch cantilever beyond the sides to allow up to 3 Bessie clamps or 6 smaller clamps to fit on each holder. Once the pieces were cut out, it was just a matter of spacing the brackets to fit each of the clamp styles. Marking these locations, I then began gluing and brad nailing the brackets to the 1/2-inch backer board, and I reinforced the heavier clamp holders with construction screws that were countersunk to sit at or slightly below the surface of the back. I found that this held well to allow the glue to dry without the need to clamp the pieces together during the glue up. I did, however, use clamps when attaching the tool cleat to the back of the board, and I reinforced this with some shorter sheetrock screws that I had lying around. Screw and brad nail size are also important, as you don't want fasteners pushing through the front of the holders. After allowing these to dry overnight, I hung all the clamps, and here's the final result. I really like the difference in this space from before to now, and I'll continue to expand here and add additional tool holders with power tools, hand tools, router bits, batteries, and more. Let me know what you think about the wall and if you do anything differently in this design. Also, if there's a tool holder that you'd like to see me build, please leave that in the comment section down below. You can see I've got a lot of things planned ahead to get these all up on the wall. The only thing I'd say is let's keep it within reason, as I don't want to be lifting any 300-pound objects up to this wall. If you made it this far in the video, please give it a like, but only if you found it helpful. And if you're into things like woodworking, tools, and home DIY, please consider becoming a subscriber to this channel. And for more information on the Milwaukee track saw that I used, I did an unboxing, and you check out that video right here. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.